Okay, let me say welcome. I want to get started right on time. They tell me punctuality is important, and I've got a lot of material I want to cover. I'm David Cox with the Federal Highway Administration. I'm really an Oregon citizen. I grew up here in Portland, graduated from Madison High School, went to Oregon State University, and then joined the Federal Highway Administration. I've spent most of my career in the Southeast, in Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, Texas. But here I am back home again, and along the way I got a master's degree at LSU, so both of them in civil engineering. So I've been with the Federal Highway Administration now for over 30 years, if you can imagine. Hard for me to imagine. So I had a lot that I wanted to say and a lot that I wanted to cover today, and as I was putting my talk together, I was sending my staff, go here, get this, find me this information, get me a picture of this, find this report. And they were fluttering all around, and they finally, one of them looked at me and he said, you know, you remind me of a mosquito at a nudist colony. And I thought, mosquito at a nudist colony? He said, yeah, you know what you want to do, but you don't know where you want to start. And I thought, yeah, that's right. That was true. I had to admit I knew that. So I've tried to get a little organized since he gave me that hint that I wasn't too organized. So this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk to you some about legislation and the history of the federal legislation. And then I'm going to give you some national perspective about transportation from a federal highway point of view. And I'm going to work in some Oregon, Portland issues. And finally, I just can't help but take the chance. I don't talk to students that often, so I've got some opinions I'd like to offer to you students here for what they're worth. So let me start with the legislation. Maybe many of you know that we have been operating under T21. That expired October of last year, October of 2003. These are usually 6-year bills. The one before it, Ice-T, was a 6-year bill too. This is their rate in billions of dollars over those 6 years. So a $218 billion bill expired. What are we to do? That's our question. And why can't we get another bill? Well, the administration, the Senate, and the House both have put in competing versions of what the next bill should say. But look at how different they are in terms of dollars. They were never able to come to agreement. So here we are, over a year later, still no bill, still no guiding legislation. Now, there has been some movement. These red lines show where things stand today. The administration says, well, we can go a little higher. The Senate says, great, we'll take a little more. But the House has come down to a more in-line figure. Still, that's too much for them to come to a compromise, apparently, because we still have no bill. So what are we going to do? Well, the way Congress has handled this is they've extended T21. We're now in our 6th extension. This one's a little bit longer, 8 months. But, you know, highway projects are multi-year things, and we need to plan, and we need to know for sure how much money are we going to have next year and the year after and the year after. Well, we're in the situation where we don't know that. So this makes it really difficult for us to operate. And I was hoping, maybe the lame duck session could pass something. But after the election this week, I'm thinking that no, the lame duck session is not going to make much progress because there's going to be such a change in the Senate. I think they'll probably wait till next year. So the hope that I had is fading for the lame duck session. I'm afraid it'll be next year before we get a real bill. I hope it is another 6-year bill. History has shown that it usually is, but not always. And I'm wondering now, the President says he's got a new mandate. I'm wondering what his priorities will be and whether or not they've changed. So really, rather than get into what the proposals say and what the bills have as their various and differing positions, it's probably not worthwhile because they're still under discussion and review. But I'd ask you, if you are interested in, and probably you should be interested in this subject, to keep up with it at our website, fhwa.dot.gov. There's side-by-side comparisons of the bills there, and they update it as agreements are made and progress is made. So I just think, though, that you should understand that's the situation that we're operating under right now and have been for over a year. So our DOTs, not just ODOT, but all across the nation, have not been able to plan and not been able to project their project lists with as much certainty as they usually do. Okay, I want to talk to you then, moving down my list as I got organized, about what Federal Highways calls the vital few. And if you ask yourself, what does a highway agency do? What does the Federal Highway Administration do? What does any highway agency do? You could make a long list of things they do. So that's not the hard part. The hard part is saying which are the most important. Of that long list of things they do, which are the 2 or 3 that are the most important? And that's what the Federal Highway Administration has done. They've said safety, the environment, and congestion mitigation are our 3 most important things. That's what we need to concentrate on. And so that's what I want to do today, is spend just a few minutes talking to you about each one of those things. As far as safety, we've had it now as a vital few goal for about 3 years, but within the vital few goal, the emphasis areas change. This year it's intersections, roadway departures, and pedestrians. Those are all very appropriate for Oregon. Turns out very appropriate for Portland too, because you've got problems in these areas as far as safety goes, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Federal highways, and really the highway transportation area in general, measures safety in terms of people killed per 100 million vehicle miles driven. Now, maybe you've heard of that rate before, but that's the way we measure it. Right now, the top red line shows that we're down to around 1.5 people per 100 million vehicle miles. Actually, this year was 1.48. So we're getting down. Sounds like a lot. When I went to school at Oregon State, we were talking then about trying to get the number down to 5. 5 people killed per 100 million vehicle miles. Now we're down to 1.48. So we've made a lot of progress in terms of rate, but more people are driving. And so really in terms of fatalities, it has been a drop from about 50 or 60,000 people killed a year back in the 1970s to around 42 or so now, and I'll show you those figures. So the rate has dropped significantly. The numbers of people killed are still obviously way too high. Here's a bright spot. Trucks, large trucks. The fatality rate and the number of fatalities has been coming down year after year for a number of years, kind of contrary to what our opinion is, especially when we drive up beside one of those big ones. Motorcycles is kind of a surprise to all of us, but motorcycle fatalities are going up, up, up. States are repealing their helmet laws. And another thing is we think it's a demographic change. A lot of people my age maybe used to ride a motorcycle when they were teenagers or in their 20s. Now again, they're my age, they can afford one finally. And they can really afford to get a nice big one, the one they couldn't afford before. And maybe they're not quite as good a driver or rider as they used to be. And so they're dying. So motorcycles, because of demographics and because of law changes, is a problem. And alcohol and drugs, after years and years and years of the rate coming down, 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 it's turned around and started going up again. We had Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, Students Against Drunk Drivers to thank for that. We don't really know why the turnaround is happening, but that's certainly an area of concern for us. To put it all in perspective, nationwide in Oregon, this is a little bit complicated, but across the top line is the number of fatalities in the nation every year. Right now, as I say, it was 246 last year. This red line is Federal Highway's goal. This is what we hope we can achieve by 2008. And then on another scale, but as a way of comparing, the green is Oregon's experience. So you can see that Oregon really has done better than the nation over the last several years in lowering their number of fatalities, but still, last year was a very bad year, second worst in the nation, a 17% increase, up to over 500, a value we hoped we would never see again. Still, they're right at where Federal Highways sort of projected they might be. So there's some room for optimism. We've done good, better than the nation, but still we had a bad year last year.
Are those on the same scale?
No, they're not on the same scale. So this is the scale for the nationwide over here. This is the Oregon scale, and what we did is match them here, and then we made the proportional change equal the proportional change over here so that we could compare them on the same graph. Now, this is a scale of the injury rate, and there is just one scale nationwide. Again, it works the same. This is the nationwide injury rate, 102 injuries per 100 million vehicle miles, same measure. Federal Highway's goal to get down to the high 80s by 2008. And you can see that Oregon has done a lot better than that. In fact, Oregon is now where we hope the rest of the nation can be in 10 years from now. So Oregon's done really well. Strong seatbelt laws, infant laws, graduated driver's license laws. We think those are the reasons that Oregon's been so successful. As far as Portland, Portland represents the Portland area about 42% of the population of Oregon, and yet you only have about 25% of the fatalities, highway fatalities in Oregon. So Oregon streets are safer. Now, why would that be? Well, our most dangerous road are rural two-lane highways, because usually people go fast, their shoulders are narrow, the ditches are deep, there's something bad to hit when you get outside of that. So Portland in the urban area doesn't have any of those. So that's one reason. Speeds are generally slower in an urban area is another. But your rate of fatalities due to alcohol is higher than the state, and your pedestrian fatalities are way up. 30% of the fatalities in Portland are pedestrian fatalities, compared to less than 10% for the rest of the state. So those are some areas we need to work on. I wish I had more time and could talk about each of these, but I'm going to talk about the vital few just in sort of snippets, and so I have to move on now to the environment. And in the environment, again, we have a list of things we're looking at: streamlining, context-sensitive solutions, animal crossings. I'll talk about those just briefly. But one thing people might not know is how long it takes us to evaluate the environment of a future project, especially a large project where we have to do an environmental impact statement. At a point in our history, we had been up to nearly 6 years. We all realized that's not where we want to be too long. Our goal is to get that down to 3 years, and in Oregon we're under 5, say, on average. So we're headed down, but still, that's an awful long time to spend just studying and evaluating the environmental impacts of a project. We formed something in Oregon called CEDAS, which has really attracted the attention of other states across the nation. It's a group of 11 different environmental agencies, state and federal, that get together and look at a project before it's really a project, look at the potential location, the potential environmental impacts, and try and make decisions as to which way to go and which is the least harmful, and if we have to go this way, well, how can we mitigate that damage, so that by the time the project becomes a reality and it's time to get a permit, they already are familiar with the project and they have already decided how best to mitigate the damages. So this is really saving us time, and across the nation other people are starting to make their own environmental committees like that. And we're into something we call context-sensitive solutions. That means we want to design projects so they fit their location. A project in Portland should look different than a project in San Diego or Phoenix. And right now, you won't necessarily be able to say that, but that's our goal. We want projects to be seen as a community asset, not necessarily just a necessary evil. One way we're doing that is allowing and paying for artwork and architectural changes. Here is a job in Arizona that looks like Arizona. It's not just an urban thing, it's also a rural thing, and you often have seen a new highway, say, make a cut, a rock cut, or make a scar in the landscape. That's not what we want, that's not what anybody wants. Here's a new cut in Arizona where they've taken and stained the rock to make it look old. So if you look at this, you might think, gee, that's part of the natural landscape. And that's the idea. We don't want to create a scar on the environment. So that's our goal in context-sensitive. ODOT has adopted the context-sensitive philosophy and is trying to do all their projects now like that. Animal crossings is another emphasis area that we're really looking at now strongly and have been for the last few years. And it's hard to get a number, but you can be sure that every year tens of millions of animals are killed on the highways in the United States. And it really doesn't matter whether they're big or small or slow or fast. When they have a collision with a car, they're the losers. But you know, they're not the only losers. Sometimes people are the losers too. Here's a collision with a moose from Maine. Every year about 250 people are killed in animal-vehicle interactions, and 26,000 are injured. I kind of said that funny, animal-vehicle interactions, because they're not all collisions. About half of them are real collisions. Half of them the driver swerves and tries to miss the animal and ends up hitting something else or running off the road. So the question is, what can we do about this? And Canada is way ahead of us. They're building overpasses just for animals and underpasses, not to carry the river or the stream, but for animals. And then they do a lot of fencing to help steer and guide the animals there. That's really our goal. We've started doing that here in Oregon. We're maybe gone a little fast. We've got a new road from Corvallis to the coast, Highway 20, where we're putting in 4 animal undercrossings. And now when we build a bridge to span a stream, we're trying to build it a little bit longer to provide a place for animals to cross as well. So we're trying to adopt these policies and make a difference in that area. Okay, looking at number 3 of the vital few, congestion. The first question we need to understand is what is congestion? And we used to think of congestion just in terms of the rush hour, that hour or so in the morning and the hour or so in the afternoon when congestion got bad. But the trouble is that hour has stretched to 2 and 2.5 and maybe 3 in some cities in both directions. It's not leaving much time in the middle. And in the middle is when a lot of the trucks make deliveries, and a lot of people get out in the middle hoping to avoid congestion. So that middle time is getting congested too, the lunch hour time. So we need to understand that it's not just the rush hour. And because it is so hard to get in and out of the central business district, businesses now are locating on the fringes of the urban area. So the fringes are having their own rush area. So the whole idea of what is congestion has really changed, and our approach to fighting it has got to change also. It's not just a nuisance, it's a financial burden also, and the Texas Transportation Institute, which Portland State uses a lot of their data, the Texas Transportation Institute has estimated that congestion costs the average commuter in Portland over $700 a year. Just the average person, 360 some. It costs our motorists 54 million extra gallons of gasoline because of congestion. And the average commuter spends over 40 hours just sitting in traffic. Overall economic impact of Portland is about $600 million. I want to show you this because this is the Texas Transportation Institute data displayed in a way you probably haven't seen it before, and it takes a minute to explain. But Texas Transportation Institute gets information on congestion from the 75 largest urbanized areas in the nation. So this is a display of that data with Portland compared to the other 75. And the key to understanding this chart is looking first at the dark blue line. That's the rank, the rank of Portland's population. So back here in 1980, Portland was the 25th largest city. And although there have been some changes, here we are around 2000. Portland is again the 25th largest city. So all things being equal, you would think the 25th largest city would have the 25th worst congestion. All of these other lines are measures of congestion. If that were true, all of these lines would lie right along the population line. Where the line is higher than the population line, that means it's better. The congestion is not as bad as a city that size might expect to have. Where it's below the line, congestion is worse than a city this size might expect to have. So anything above the line is good. Below the line means you're not doing so well. You can see the trend over the last 20 years of what's happened here in Portland. By every measure, congestion has gotten worse. And now, by every measure I have displayed up here, congestion is worse than it should be for a city this size. Yes?
Just for presentation purposes, you may want to invert that graph because it kind of works against your point.
So the worst is shown on the top instead of on the bottom. Now that's probably a good idea. This would be like Los Angeles down here. Yeah. Well, for the rest of this talk, they're all like this. But I don't think we need this statistics to answer the question, is congestion getting worse in Portland? Those of you who've lived here a while can answer that without the statistics. Yes, it is. We're often compared to Seattle, and I thought I would show you this one. Here's Seattle's population, about 20 to 18th or so, and here's their congestion measures grouped around 5. So they're about the 5th worst city in the nation as far as congestion goes, even though they are the 18th or so largest. So thank goodness, at least we're not as bad as Seattle. I wanted to show you a few others because a lot of people think, gee, there's nothing we can do about this. You know, once congestion starts to get worse, we're stuck with worse congestion. But here's Salt Lake City. Now, many of you probably know what happened right about here. they said, the Olympics is coming. We got to do something. And so they started working on their highway system. They put in a light rail system. And all of a sudden, their numbers started to turn around. So it's not hopeless. You know, there is something you can do about congestion if you have the will and if you have the desire to make the change. And Salt Lake City is a good example of that. One more, I wanted to show you New Orleans because I said I worked in the South, and I've actually worked in New Orleans. I worked there in the 80s. They were really in a building boom then. They were building what's called the West Bank Expressway. They put 2 new bridges across the Mississippi. They completed Interstate 310, a spur on the west side of the city, and Interstate 510, a spur on the east side of the city. And that investment, you can see, has paid off for them for decades. They've been improving, and now they've gone from being much worse than they should have been to where they're actually better than you might expect. So their investment has paid off. What can we do about it here in Portland? Well, the American Highway Users Alliance says there are over 200 bottlenecks in the nation, and wouldn't you know it, we've got 5 of them here in Oregon, and those 5 in Oregon are all in Portland. There they are, the Columbia River Bridge across I-5. That's one of the worst bottlenecks in the nation. I-5, I-84. You probably don't even need them to tell you that. We know that. Here's one that surprised me a little bit. Murray Boulevard, Highway 26. That's one of the worst in the nation. And Canyon Road on 217 is another one. And finally, our 5th one, the worst one as far as the national list, is Powell at 205. So we have 5 of the worst by their standards. If we would write our own standards, I'm sure we could find a lot more. My office has looked at, okay, how much user cost, how much are these costing users every year? That's these black numbers here. So 38 million is lost to the users every year. And then what would it cost to repair these? In fact, ODOT is actually working on some of these. And this is the cost of the ODOT figures. So you can see 20, 30 million or so a year in user costs and 30 or 40 million to repair them. They pay for themselves within a little more than a year, the repair work, and yet they'll serve the public for decades after that. So we really think it's worth fixing these. Without fixing them, I think the picture shows what we think is happening to the user costs. And people all across the nation have started fixing these, and they find out not just do they save time for the drivers, but air pollution gets better because people aren't stuck in these jams all the time. And they use less fuel. Fuel usage goes down, and actually they're safer when they move well. So we're hoping to get Oregon's attention, Portland's attention to the fact they need to do something with their bottlenecks. Now some people think, well, the price of gas is going up. Maybe this is going to fix itself. Fewer and fewer people are going to be able to afford to drive, and congestion will go away. In fact, I liked this cartoon. The price of unleaded is $9.79. And the guy says, so help me, if gas hits $10 a gallon, I'll stop driving, I swear I will. And I've heard people say, the number's a little different, but they say the same things. If gas gets such and such high, I'm going to cut back. Well, no, if it gets if it gets here, I'm going to cut back. I don't know. Cutting back is hard for people to do. And even as high as prices have been, historically high levels, fuel sales are up, and vehicle miles traveled is way up in Oregon. It has to do with the economy more than the price of fuel. Almost a 6% increase this year over last year, and that's with the high fuel prices. So I'm not thinking that the high fuel prices are going to stop people from driving, at least not as long as they keep in the ranges that they are. And that doesn't say a thing about freight. This is an estimate from the Port of Portland about the tonnage hauled by different modes in and out of their port. This is their estimate for trucks. This is their estimate for rail, water, pipeline, air. You see, rail is really making a big improvement. Rail is almost doubling. Does it make a difference? Not really. Trucks are going to double, and double from a big number to a much bigger number. Federal Highways estimates tonnage is going to increase about 85% over 20 years. So more and more vehicles driving more and more miles, plus more and more trucks driving more and more miles. That's what we have projected. Okay, I got to move on from congestion, but I'd be glad to talk about that afterwards or some other time. I want to talk about some Oregon issues that I think you've heard about and some Portland issues, and one of them is the cracked girder problem. And I mentioned I used to work in Louisiana. One of my jobs in Louisiana was to inspect bridges, actually crawl under the bridge and look and see what condition it was. That could be a scary job in Louisiana. Not just alligators, snakes. Snakes is what I used to worry about. But anyway, it's scary to do it in Portland, in Oregon too. Not alligators or snakes, but cracks. You get under there and you think, wow, should I even be under here? And the cracks can be big. This is one of the bigger ones, but virtually every concrete girder bridge of a certain age has cracks. And some of them are widening and growing, and that's really the problem. There's almost 500 that are going to be replaced by the Oregon Transportation Investment Act over the next 8 years. And of those 500, we think 41 of them are particularly critical because we feel if one of those members breaks, the bridge could fall. The other bridges have members that we feel if one of them breaks, the other members can take the load. So we've made a special effort with ODOT, and we've actually assigned an agreement to address those 41 first. They've done 38 of them, so I won't tell you where the other 3 are, but you're pretty safe. Okay, let me talk about a few other things in Portland. I know you've heard about I-5, especially I-5 from right about here at the interchange with 84 on up across the bridge. That's going to be our first mega project in Oregon, and by mega project we mean project that costs more than $1 billion. We're looking now at how to do it, trying to cooperate with Washington DOT, with Vancouver and Portland cities, looking at funding schemes, looking at whether we need to put a toll on the new bridge. If we put a toll on the I-5 bridge, do we need to also toll 205? Questions we're trying to answer right now, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about them. We are doing some things with Portland State, helping to fund some of the studies here and some of the activities here, and also working in employment. Linda, I have to mention Linda Anderson, was an intern with us one summer, and we're anxious to hire not just interns but permanent employees also. People sometimes who talk about smart growth think about highway agencies as sort of like the enemy. They don't know that we are a big funder. In fact, Federal Highways is the major funding source for the Transportation Growth Management Program run by DLCD. We put in $4 to $5 million a year into that program, more than the state puts in, so that they can plan the growth around cities and the transportation network needed to accommodate that growth. What about the future? Well, I think we're going to need to use our right-of-ways much more efficiently than we do now, and we've started. You can see Airport Max does use 205 right-of-way. Max along 84 uses Interstate 84 right-of-way. There's a lot of sharing going on. I think we're going to have more and more of that in our future. We need to use our information better, not just publicly, but share it more privately also. Some folks want to sell it. We're trying to make all the information public so that you don't have to buy it. So if you want to know about congestion somewhere, you can look on the internet and see the camera without paying a fee, or dial 511 and hear about it without paying a fee. That's our goal. And we want to work more with the auto industry. A lot of cars now offer some kind of route guidance system, but it's not real time. In other words, it tells you the same route by shortest distance, any time of day, any time you go there. They should be real time. They should be tied into the loop detectors. They should be tied into the computer signal system so that they know where the congestion is, so that they can route you away to avoid the congestion. And they should have more collision avoidance features in them, and we probably need to put something in our pavements to help them with the collision avoidance. So we need to work on that partnership. And certainly trucking and freight, anything we can do to get a load off of a truck onto a train, we ought to do. Okay, opinion time. I can't resist. So let me start by asking you how you got to this meeting today. How many of you walked to this seminar? How about ride your bike? Anybody ride a bike? How many of you took transit? And how many of you used the highway system? See, actually that was a trick question. You knew it would be. because you all use the highway system. Even transit, the buses, ride on the highways. The sidewalks are built with highway funds, as are the bike paths. You all use the highway system to get here, and yet when we hear this, we seem to think it's highways or transit. Actually, where would the bus system be without the highway? It's not one or the other, and I think we need to adjust our mindset a little bit. So that's my first thing. The second thing is there's a lot of talk about traveling less, shortening trips, not making fewer trips. I really think freedom of movement is what this country is built on. We have a huge country, and we often compare ourselves to European countries, say, oh, gee, we travel a lot more than they do. Well, yeah, we do, and I think there's a reason for that. Plus, our foundation of our economy is really, in Oregon, built a lot on transportation. Tourism is a big part of many states' economy. Tourism without transportation is nothing. And Portland is a real high-use transportation city when it comes to employment. 1 in 10 of the jobs in Portland are transportation-related. We need to remember that. The same with smart growth. We talk about smart growth, but I think growth without transportation is really not very smart. Think about what we like about Oregon. We can go to the coast. We can go to the mountains. We can go to the gorge. We can go camping. All those involve trips. All those improve our quality of life. Think about the United States as we try to compete with foreign competitors. What have we got? Well, we've got very high labor costs. We've got very high materials costs. What makes us competitive? We have low transportation costs. That's what helps keep us competitive. And in fact, we did a little looking back. In around 1980, transportation represented about 18% of the gross domestic product. Now it's down to 10%. We've gotten that much more efficient. Sure, the economy has grown, but the slice of it devoted to moving things and people around has shrunk. So we've really made ourselves more efficient and better competitors because of that. I think this idea of thinking pro-highway, pro-transit is really going out of favor. I hope that it is, because to me it's not a productive way. I think we should look more at a market-based method of making choices. What do our customers want? What's the most efficient way? What has the highest benefit-cost ratio? What's the safest way? What hurts the environment the least? We should make decisions based on those criteria, but we don't seem to. We seem to say, oh, we're going to put the rail here and we're going to build the highway there. We sort of predetermine the decision. I don't think that's the way we should really do it. To make a system like that work, though, you have to ask yourself, what constitutes a good trip? And I put a few things up here that I think make a good trip, but it's a question that needs to be asked. But for me, a good trip, it's when I want to go, it's ready to go. It goes right to where I want to go. It doesn't take some circuitous route, and it's fast, and it's safe, and it's pleasant, and it doesn't hurt the environment. And I think those are the things that constitute a good trip from my mind. So you have to take that list, whatever your list is, and measure it against the transportation options and see what meets that the best. And we often, even we professionals, forget about freight. But freight is so big, you know, the elephant in the room that we're not going to be able to forget about, and it's growing. Not only is it growing, but they're paying our bills. We get about 25% of our federal aid tax dollars from the freight side. So even when we want to ignore them, they're right there to tell us, whoa, you can't ignore us, don't ignore us. And they are getting safer. They're also getting cleaner, and I'm sure you all know about the new diesel emission regulations coming into effect. I talked about funding, and I want to make this point about where federal transportation funds come from. That's highway and transit. They come from the Highway Trust Fund. There's really 4 sources: fuel tax, heavy vehicle tax, sales tax, and tire tax. So 4 sources. Predominantly, though, it's from the fuel taxes. And since in the 80s, a portion of the Highway Trust Fund was broken out and called the transit account. So now the Highway Trust Fund consists of the transit account and the highway account. The transit account is about 15%. But I think it's important to realize the transit account is funded by highway users, not by transit users. Now, Oregon has done fantastic. You would think with 15% of the federal aid money devoted to transit that Oregon would have gotten about 15% of their federal aid dollars for transit, but no, they haven't. Oregon has gotten about $1.5 billion in the last 10 years for transit and 2.8 billion for highways, so about 1/30 or so for transit. Because transit is not given by formula. Transit is given by grant. And if a city says they're ready and a city wants it, they can apply. Portland's been very aggressive and very successful. So when we think that transit is underfunded, primarily this money went to Portland. Primarily this money went to somewhere other than Portland in Oregon by choice, because our city fathers have traded their highway dollars for transit dollars. So transit is really, at least you can't say that it's underfunded in Portland. It's much better funded than highways are. And so my question is that right? Is that fair? Is that a good public policy decision? If you look at the trip to work in Portland, transit carries 6.7% of the trips to work. The rest of the state, much less. Overall, in Portland, transit carries about 2.5% of the trips. That's MAX, that's the bus, that's the trolley, that's even taxis. Taxis are included as transit. Nationally, it's about 2%, so Oregon is doing better than the nation. That figure, 2.5%, 3%, has remained relatively constant since the 50s. It's remained constant through all of Portland's growth in far as MAX lines and transit. That doesn't really change much. The FTA now has a goal to increase it to 3%. That's their goal. So you ask yourself, and, I should mention this, because transit trips are shorter than auto trips, vehicle miles traveled is less than 2%. So the question is, how much of your transportation dollars should you spend to meet 2% of your need and none of your freight need? Well, Oregon is spending over 35% of their transportation dollar to meet 2% of their need. Is that the right decision? That's the question. I think we need to remember user pays, and I heard that Washington State just turned down a transit initiative. I think this is probably one of the reasons, because it wasn't funded by users. I'm hoping that we'll get to where we measure progress, not by how many ribbons we cut or by how many projects we start, but by really how we move the numbers. You know, what do the projects that we build do as far as safety, as far as trip speed, as far as environmental costs? That's how I hope that we start measuring progress. That doesn't seem to be the way we're doing it, though. We think we're making progress while all the numbers are going a different direction. And I hope when we make choices, like I said before, whether it's highways or transit or whether it's what to do within highways or transit, we'll do it based on a set of criteria that we've established, that we all can agree on and all can aspire to, and then we'll keep track of how we're doing in meeting those criteria. Just a little bit of talk about being a public servant, because you in transportation, planners, engineers, the likelihood is that many of you will go to work for government agencies and you'll be public servants. I'm a public servant, and I think my first job is meeting the needs of the public. It's not trying to change opinions or not trying to force them to jump through a hoop that they don't want to jump through. My first job is trying to meet their needs. Now, that doesn't say you can't educate and you can't try and change opinion, but I think first you should try and meet the needs. And I think in Oregon and in Portland, I don't always see our public servants doing that. Okay, so winding up, it's really not that hard. I think no matter what we do, safety has to be our #1 goal. Right after that, we need to try and improve mobility. To me, to let these bottlenecks stay out there, when we know we can fix them and we know we can be so cost-effective in fixing them, it's really not the responsible thing to do. I don't know why we don't fix them. We don't, in most cases, need more land. It's not a matter of more right-of-way or displacing people. And, of course, we need to improve the environment. And I don't think that it's really fair to saddle future generations with the cost of a transportation facility that then needs continually to be fed and operated and maintained. So, to wind up then, last slide, what am I going to do when the new bill comes out? I'm an Oregonian and a federal employee. It's not really a conflict. Oregon has to meet the law, the new federal law, but there are often different ways to meet the law, and I'm here to try and help ODOT meet it in the way most advantageous to Oregon. I think the vital few that I mentioned are a good idea. I wish ODOT would adopt those. I wish the city of Portland would adopt those, because I think they need to focus. And I think they need to say, look, public, this is what we're trying to do, and here's our measurement year after year trying to achieve that. And put it out there and let the public judge whether or not they're successful. So I guess with that, I have left some time for questions. That's the end of my prepared talk. If there are any questions. Yes.
I have a question about funding. I guess tolls versus taxes, or I'm just curious where most of the funding comes from.
Oh, most of the funding, in fact, all the funding in Oregon comes from gas tax, from user tax. So the state is funded purely by gas tax and then weight mile tax for trucks. It's the only state that I know of that doesn't charge the trucks a tax on diesel. It's purely weight mile. From a federal point of view, it's those four sources that I talked about. Tolls don't really belong to the federal government. If Oregon were to collect tolls, they would be Oregon's tolls or Portland's tolls. They wouldn't go to the federal government. So as far as federal sources, it's the gas tax and the tire tax, sales tax that I mentioned. Right now that generates $35–40 billion a year. Yes?
You break down the federal funds going to highway and transit.
Yes.
And what percent of those funds go to capital costs and what go to operating costs?
Yeah, the law says that all of them should go to capital cost, that really operations and maintenance is the responsibility of the locals. So the federal government wants to pay to build something, and in order to get that money, the states and cities will then agree, okay, we'll maintain it and operate it if only you'll give us the money to help build it. So that's the typical agreement. Now, when it comes to the transit side, that definition of capital and operating and maintenance have sort of morphed a little bit. There's some things in there that you might think of as operations or maintenance, but that are actually called capital costs and are eligible for federal aid funds. The highway side, the line is a little bit clearer. So it's just capital and not operations or maintenance. Yes?
Yeah, on as far as how expensive it is during congestion times, cost for everybody in the country, have you guys done any congestion pricing estimates, and if there's any cost benefits in going to some of those the things that you fit in your window, so to check the congestion?
Yes, we have. In fact, there are several studies all over the nation funded by the Federal Highway Administration on congestion pricing. Oregon is doing one of them, and maybe you've heard of the Rough Tough Committee that's looking at charging by the mile rather than on gas purchases. So the mileage you drive is accumulated and your taxes paid on that rather than at a price per gallon. And the idea is that with the right equipment, you could differentiate which miles were driven inside the city or outside the city. The miles driven inside the city might be more expensive than the miles driven outside the city. Or you could maybe tell what time they were. So the miles driven at rush hour would be more expensive than the miles driven at non-rush hour. So we're looking at those things, yes. The trouble is public acceptance is a very difficult thing to gain on those sorts of things. But yes, we're looking at it. Sure.
I had a question regarding your first chart or graph that you had up there with Portland, where the...
Okay, let's see. Maybe I can do that. Which one was it? Tell me a little more.
The very first chart would be right there, or
Oh,
right there.
Yeah, okay.
And it's just a question, I guess, an opinion about how you feel about light rail in Oregon. And it seems a lot of these things were in '85 when they put the light rail in. Everything was, congestion looked to be not too bad of a thing. And since then, Portland's a pretty heavy proponent of light rail, so everything seems to.
Well,
Just your opinion.
Yeah. My opinion is that light rail is very expensive, not just very expensive to build, but expensive to maintain and operate. And you can answer the question yourself. Did it make a difference? Has congestion gotten better? Is there less congestion because of light rail, even along 84? I think there are estimates, and Texas Transportation Institute makes estimates that say things would be even worse than they are now if it weren't for light rail. So the question is, was the amount we spent on light rail well spent, or what if we would have spent that amount on highways? Would we have made even greater improvements? That's the question, and that's hard to answer. But if you look at the proportion of funds spent on light rail and the benefit, that's where you should make a decision. And to me, it's very, very expensive. The light rail, they're talking about extending light rail from Gateway to Clackamas Town Center along 205. And I believe the estimates are that in 20 years, it'll carry about 20,000 people. One freeway lane could easily carry 20,000 people also. The cost of the light rail is $450, 500 million. You could probably build a 6-mile lane of highway for 30 or 40 million. There are different users. That's another thing I should say. They're not the same users, and some people who can use light rail can't afford a car. So I think you've got to be careful there. We want to provide for all of our users as well. Yes? Or
Where would you suggest that the savings go? Like in that example, like let's say the transit wasn't built in a highway lane was built. Where should all that savings go?
I would fix the bottlenecks first, and then I would put in more of what they call HOV lanes or hot lanes, lanes that carry and cater to high occupancy vehicles. So I think that, and then I don't know if Portland can support new routes. There gets to be a point where you just can't widen the road any farther, and the city fathers of Portland have decided our freeways are at that point. So, I mean, to me, you have to look for new routes. Yes?
For the communities that have built a lot of these toll roads, and I guess I'm thinking of Dallas, Houston, Orange County, did FHWA come in with funds, capital funds, to help those projects get started, or were those completely initiatives funded by the tolls that they put in place?
Yeah, both. And now Oregon also has laws that allow public-private partnerships where the government and the private entities can join together, build a road, put a toll on it so that eventually the private entity is paid off with profit, and then the road reverts to public ownership at that point. So a lot of them are built like that. Europe is very big in just giving their roads to a private entity. They may have a concessionaire in Europe that's a 50-year concession or even more. So it's just almost as if it's owned by the private sector rather than the public sector. We're probably headed in that direction, but I don't know if we'll ever go quite that far. Yes.
Doesn't that toll system sort of restrict movement, I would think? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, the toll system can divert vehicles. Maybe that's what you're talking about. And we're concerned about that. If we put a toll on I-5 bridges, will people take 205 instead just to avoid the toll? Well, it depends on where they start, where they're going, of course, but some people obviously will. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we want people off of I-5, and that's one way to get them off of I-5. So, but then we put on the toll in order to help us pay for the bridge. So if we're diverting traffic, we're losing revenue. So it's kind of a balancing thing. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, behind?
You showed an example of Salt Lake City. You said,
Yes.
that basically that congestion kind of went down. How much of that money for all that construction came from the federal sources, and do you think that that is a permanent solution, and can the feds afford to do construction like that nationwide?
A lot of it came from federal sources, and there were two sources. FTA also, which I'm less familiar with, but built the light rail several hundreds of millions. The highway work was about $1.4 billion. but it's paid for over years. They buy bonds and then pay out the bonds over years. So it's not a permanent solution, no. As long as the population keeps growing like it is at about 2% a year, and vehicle miles traveled keep increasing at 3% a year, and truck volume keeps increasing at 5% a year, it's not going to be a permanent solution. But it's a lot better than doing this. And if something needs to be done, we still have the option in the future years to do it. So I think it's worth doing. Obviously, they did too. Yes?
I'm hoping you can talk. Excuse me. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the Willamette River bridges here in Portland. Some are federal highways, some are state, some are county owned, and there seems to be a lot of conflict in terms of maintenance and operational priorities. And what's the federal government's role, if any, in kind of determining bridge policy?
Yeah. Actually, none of them are owned by the federal government. The Markham and the Fremont, is that it, are both owned by the state. It's my understanding the rest are owned by the county because the city won't accept them because they know of the maintenance responsibility and liabilities involved, so they won't take them. Our responsibility is really to make sure that ODOT lives up to its agreement. So when we gave them money to build those bridges, they said they would maintain them. And so now they have to live up to that agreement and maintain them. And it bothers me to see that they need repainting. All of them need repainting, and ODOT has not repainted them. I know there's probably starting to be some structural implications from that not painting. So, I mean, that's something ODOT needs to do. So another thing that bothers me is they are not ready for an earthquake. Finally, the Markham Bridge has done some retrofit, but if I understand the others are not. Even a small earthquake might be too much for most of the others. So our role is in bridge that the states have to maintain the bridges, and they have to inspect the bridges. So we make sure that the bridges are inspected on a rotating cycle, either annually or every 2 years, and that's what we do. And then when they find something wrong, they either have to fix it or they have to post it to restrict the legal load limits. That's how we found, actually it was Federal Highways that found this cracking under all these bridges here in Oregon. We're the ones that told Oregon, look, you've got to do something about it. Yes?
You talked about, the environment as one of the priorities. For any given project, what percentage of the money is mandated to go to environmental improvements? And, for example, ODOT just completed the I-5 resurfacing project through Portland. And what were some of the environmental components of that? Do you know?
Yeah, that probably didn't have many. Noise and dust would probably be the major ones, and perhaps some containment if there was any soil disturbed to keep runoff from reaching the streams. There's not a set percentage. It's really they have to do whatever they have to do. And it's hard to make a set percentage. I mentioned to you about the CEDIS group and picking alignments and where to build a new road. Well, maybe they would be an alignment that would be much cheaper but cause more environmental damage. So instead of going through the wetlands, they go around the wetlands. It's hard to know how much extra cost was spent going around because we never really calculated how much to go through. So I'm sure in some cases it's 50-60% of the job would be environmental. In others it's just a few percentage. But we mitigate the damage that we have to do. We first of all try and avoid, then we minimize, then we mitigate, and then we enhance. So for instance, if we don't have to take a wetland acre, we won't take an acre of wetlands if there's any way around it. If we have to take it, we'll mitigate that. And right now, our mitigation ratio is about 3 to 1. So if we take an acre of wetlands, we'll recreate 3 acres somewhere else. And we'll do it in conjunction with the state agencies responsible for maintaining wetlands. So they'll tell us, oh, where's the best place? What do you want? How should it be? So really, wetland acres are increasing because of our policies in that regard. We're trying to protect any endangered plant or fish or animal we won't touch unless we absolutely have to, and we really don't. We can usually find a way not to. And a lot of archaeological work, the digs that you hear about are really funded by federal highways and state highway agencies because we've got the money, and when we encounter something, we support the investigation of those remains. whereas no one else seems to have the funds to do that. So a lot of what you read in your textbooks about archaeological finds, if you would look deep enough, you might find they have a highway source funding them. Yes? Well, I may as well.
Email question come in, and it was related to the congestion pricing question, but maybe more generally, are there things that FHWA is doing to look at the issue of increasing vehicle fuel efficiency and the revenue stream in the future?
We're all concerned that the revenue stream from fuel will flatten out around 2012 to 2015 and then maybe decline. I mean, we're concerned about the revenue stream, not saying that that's not a good thing, that we'll use less gasoline and have more efficient vehicles. That is a good thing. But then how will we replace the revenue that we've lost from that source? What other sources are there? That's what we're trying to look at. One of the bills that I didn't mention has a provision in it to do something like Oregon is doing and looking at a fee per mile driven tax to be applied nationwide. I don't know if that'll be part of the final bill or not, but there are schemes, and there is a realization that there's just not enough money generated. And in the future, especially, there won't be enough money generated to meet the needs from just the gas tax alone. Yes?
In your opinion, what type of funding challenges would need to be worked out between Oregon and Washington in regards to fixing, like, the I-5 bottleneck, because the benefit would actually benefit both states? What kind of funding issues would have to be tackled?
Yeah, they would first need to decide who's going to be in charge, and they're trying to decide that right now for the river crossing itself. It's not good to have one in charge on one side up to the state line and the other in charge. So the whole bridge structure itself needs to be run by one side or the other. Now, that doesn't mean funded by one side or the other. Typically, it's a calculation. How much does your side cost versus how much does their side cost, based on where the state line is and what's built. So in that situation, for instance, I think the channel is the state line, and that's closer to the Washington side. So the majority of that bridge is in Oregon, if I've got my geography right. But that's the way it's calculated anyway, from the state line to either side. That bridge is likely to have a light rail on it also. And then there's a railroad bridge downstream not too far that could be affected. We're worried, in fact, about the channel. And I guess I can say the channel is close to downtown Vancouver. So if we were to span that channel with a bridge that wouldn't need to be opened, we'd be way up in the air. It'd be hard to get down and still hit Vancouver. And then there's a little airport there on the Washington side also. So if you've got a bridge way in the air, that could interfere with the airport. So one thought is, well, maybe we should move the channel to the south side of the river. That way we could get up over it and back down before we get to Vancouver. But if we do that, then it won't align with the railroad bridge channel. And ships will have to do that, which they're not good at. So then we would have to rebuild the railroad bridge. If you're going to rebuild the railroad bridge, you may as well make it bigger and wider. So you can see how this conversation sort of scares people when they start talking about it.
Is the old bridge likely to stay and serve some other purpose, or is it coming down?
I'm sure it's coming down. It's one of those, in fact, that ODOT estimates if there's an earthquake, it will fall. Both of those, but the older one first. So what they're counting on is we would still have 205. So those bridges, the steel, I'm sure, would be salvaged, but the bridge wouldn't be there. Someone in the back?
I just have a question. Maybe we could end on the topic of safety, because I think that's pretty important. And I was on a trip a few weeks ago looking at safety measures around the world and talking to people from Sweden, where they have the zero fatality, the vision for zero fatalities. In France, they're in a program to cut fatalities in half, and not just saying that they're going to do it. And this is quite revolutionary. They're actually putting cameras out at 1,000 locations and issuing automated speed enforcement tickets. They've already issued 1 million tickets at the 120 locations they've placed these. And I know that the FHWA has a plan to decrease the numbers, but maybe we could talk for a couple of minutes about what do we really need to do kind of to put our money or our resources where our mouths are to really make a dramatic change in safety.
Yeah, there are some simple things, we think simple, that you could do. Median crossovers is one of them, and you'll notice the cable barrier now going up just south of where 205 joins I-5. Really, from there down to Salem, it's pretty much all the way. That's the sort of thing we need to do everywhere, every divided highway, and that's not real expensive. Another thing is run off the road, and I mentioned that's one of our emphasis areas. Again, rumble strips are a relatively inexpensive thing, and nearly every interstate has them. And a lot of pavement markings now give you some sort of texture that you can feel. So we're always trying to upgrade the guardrail, upgrade the impact attenuators. We're trying to make slopes flatter. There we run into environmental concerns there. To make slopes flatter means they're longer, and that means they take more land. So. And education, I still think education and the vehicle, there's more promise there than what we can wring out of the remaining things in the highway system. But you're right, enforcement is a big issue, and that's a hard one for us to get a handle on. Yes, way in the back.
That's okay. Connected to what Bertini's talking, I wonder how fatality and injury rates for specifically highways compared to roadways that involving a transit vehicle. I'm just wondering, I don't know if there's ever been a study on how safe Macs and buses are compared to
Yeah, I don't know those studies, but I'm sure they've been done. We do have a better handle on train fatalities, and highway train crossings are particularly dangerous. And we have a program to try and, first of all, separate those so there isn't really an intersection, and then secondly, put gates and arms in to protect that. But a lot of the pedestrians, and I mentioned Portland has a pedestrian accident problem. There are indications that those are, a lot of them, around transit stops. Some of them are actually buses running over people, but others are people getting off of transit vehicles, maybe not paying quite as much attention as they might have, getting hit by cars. So to say that there are to attribute those strictly to highways, I don't think is right. Some portion of those are transit related. The numbers are hard to find, though. You're right. Yes.
Is there any federal oversight of licensing of drivers? I'm thinking about the trial in Los Angeles right now about the guy
trucks
who hadn't had a driver's test since 1918 and killed 10 people.
Only for commercial vehicles. So right now, for instance, there's talk about the Mexican trucks coming all the way in, and so those Mexican drivers have to pass the same test that the U.S. drivers have to, and their trucks have to meet the same standards that the U.S. trucks have to meet.
I think we will leave it there for now. We could go on all day probably, but we should all come back next week. Carl Batten from Eco Northwest will be here to talk about Oregon's highway cost allocation study. So some of the themes that have come up today, I think we'll be able to continue on next week. The following week, we have a change in the schedule. I'll be talking about a study that we did here this summer that Mr. Cox mentioned, a performance measurement analysis that we did for the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan area. So we'll talk more about that on the 19th. And then we'll have Thanksgiving. And the final seminar is about context-sensitive multidisciplinary design of historic roads in western national parks. So some of the topics that have come up today we'll be discussing over the next few weeks. And so let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.